Welcome to another edition of CloseMode, the Enterprise Sales Show. I am Brian Dietmeyer, CEO of Close Strong, and today I'm really lucky to be here with Dave Howe, who leads the Sales Rocket. And so, Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Brian. Pleasure to be here.
So we had a discussion, and one of the things that you were doing, I'm finding more practitioners are doing, is you were building custom methodology. I've been interested in interviewing more people about, why that's happening. Before we talk about that, I'd like to get a sense of, why custom methodology? What's wrong with out of the box stuff? Now, I listened to a talk you gave recently at the Sales Enablement Collective where you're not down on out of the box methodology per se, but there's a reason why you build custom. What is that? What's wrong, or what doesn't that out of the box methodology give you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. I don't want to start off by demonizing or speaking ill of any of the fantastic methodologies out there. There's certainly lots of them. I think the analogy in that previous conversation you were alluding to, I used was choosing a methodology is kind of like being gluten-free. If you can eat gluten, eat gluten. It's in all of the best things. It's a way easier form of life. I wish that was the case for me. Unfortunately, as someone with a gluten sensitivity, this kind of rings home that those things just unfortunately don't work well with my system, and therefore I needed to find a different way forward, right? And so, a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek way of relating that to the methodology world, where if you can choose an out-of-the-box methodology, if you are in a standard tech company, maybe a Fortune 5000, or emulating one, competing against one, your product stack has a relatively low complexity, and maybe you're not in a hyper-competitive market, maybe you're a disruptor, those out-of-the-box methodologies are fantastic for a lot of companies. And, a lot of them are about 80 to 90% kind of rinse and repeat, right? They take that same kind of classic framework of the sales process and package, different valuable pieces of methodology and approaches around each stage so that we can increase the chances of success. So to kind of circle back to your original question, why choose to build a custom methodology, which admittedly is a much more painstaking process? If you are in a hyper-competitive market and you need a competitive advantage, as was the case with my previous employer and previous marketplace, that was definitely one of the big reasons. Also because we were in a highly transactional business, and we didn't have the benefit of the same outreach strategy as a lot of Fortune 5000, right? Heavily reliant on email and some cold calling in there. In the restaurant industry, which we were selling into, people don't tend to use emails nearly as much, certainly not at the kind of mom and pop shop level, much more reliant on text messages and phone conversations. So a lot of the typical methodology stuff didn't apply. And then if you compound that with also having a heavily inbound strategy, a lot of classic methodologies are built for outbound, right? They're built for that stereotypical kind of cold calling that everybody thinks of when they think of sales. And methodologies support and enhance your ability to do that. And of course, if you are a very inbound focused business and you have the benefit of a sophisticated demand generation model, a lot of methodologies simply just don't tailor to that very well. And so those were just a few of the reasons why we had in the past decided to go with a custom build instead of out of the box solutions.
And I wonder, having built some methodology myself over the years, what are the elements? And we're going to get to sort of the steps in building it, but let's start with the elements. Like if you were to chunk it out, what are the big boxes we have to fill up in order to build our own methodology?
Yeah, we decided to bring the sales process together with our industry and our product. And so those were, if speaking in broad 30,000 foot view, that's really what the benefit of a custom methodology was. is the ability to nuance much further your communication strategy than you would just with something out of the box. And so you leverage industry specifics and you layer on product information and competitive differentiation into your methodology so that they coexist rather than living as separate entities.
Yeah, it's interesting too. You just made me think of something like the number of places I've gone where they have their sales process and entry and exit gates and then they have a sales methodology they use and there's been a couple projects I've been involved in where we're kind of trying to map this methodology to the sales stages because the reps are because the sales process is what I need to do but not how, and the methodology is how, and yeah, it just became clear to me that like boom, bringing those two things together makes all the sense in the world. So what and the how, right?
Absolutely. Now, I will say, with the additional level of complexity and being specific to your organization and your industry, most importantly, your product, you also do create additional difficulties at the same time, because as soon as you layer on product, if you have a product which is changing and or growing quite rapidly, of course, you then create the issue of version control and keeping everything up to date. Right. And so that was certainly a challenge in my past life, where we had to regularly collaborate with product marketing to on a cyclical basis update our methodology because it had so much detailed product information in it. And so it's kind of that pro and con, right? The double-edged sword, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting. Jim Dickey, who some people know, who's an industry analyst, he coined this phrase once. He and I were chatting, selling at the speed of change. That, that exactly what you just said. So things have to remain nimble. I wonder, to me, one of the simplest ways I've heard a sales enablement practitioner talk about custom methodology is I was in the negotiation training business for years. And she said, well, think about it this way. You were teaching people how to negotiate. It was customized a little bit to them. But there's a difference between how do you negotiate and how do you negotiate your value against this specific competitor and achieve these commercial terms that are priorities for your deal desk. Like that to me is like you're going right to context. And so many trainings, like I said, they're lightly customized, but then somebody's got to really put them in context after the fact. Does that sound accurate to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And that certainly had been the case prior to going through the process of creating a custom methodology. Was, we everything sounded great on paper, right? In theory, but then as soon as you actually took some of that boilerplated methodology out into the real world and had real conversations in competitive deals, a lot of it just started to fall off the tracks, right? It was just, and you'd get reps and managers in meetings who would say like, yes, this all sounds great, but then ultimately they'd be detractors behind the scenes for good reason. When they're having real world conversations, the methodology just simply wasn't supporting them, and then it was just a path of less resistance to be able to revert back to price-based selling with heavy discounts, feature selling instead of value selling, which is what we were really trying to promote.
Yep. Totally agree. Well said. I really agree. So what are sort of imagine there's a bunch of prep and then you have to like build the thing out a little bit, then you have to test it a little bit. Walk me through your high level steps of building out your own methodology.
Yeah, I think, I always like using the framework people, process, and technology, PPT, to help understand all of the areas that you need to align your methodology with in order to succeed. And anyone who's familiar with the framework, the idea is that every piece of the triangle is exactly as important as the other, right? If you have fantastic people who are engaged with your methodology, but it's not aligned with your sales process or supported by your technology, the whole thing falls apart. Right. And vice versa, of course, is the case. If you align it really well with your process, but you don't go through the journey of actually interviewing people and making sure that they're bought into the methodology and that they know how to use it through the technology, again, everything falls apart, right? And so that's what I've done in the past, is look at building a custom methodology and how to align it to each part of that trifecta: the people, process, and technology.
It's also interesting to me that, and I could be wrong. I have to, but I'm pretty in touch with what's happening in the market. But a lot of this is coming from practitioners versus the providers of methodology. Like this shift of moving more to in context and more customized. And it appears to me that one of the reasons for whatever it's been 30 years people have been doing these methodology rollouts is you can do that at scale, right? And which is really in the best interest of the provider of that methodology to say, okay, I can roll this out to 8,000 reps in 20 countries, but you give up some stuff for that. So it's just kind of interesting. Unless you've seen something, I haven't seen the providers of methodologies making this shift to offering this option. I still feel like we're still rolling out methodologies globally.
I completely agree, and I think we're seeing an ongoing shift towards hyper personalization, right? And that's not just in sales, that's not just in business. I think that's in many different facets of life. But methodology is just one more example of it, where again, as I mentioned previously, things sound great in theory, but as soon as you get them into the marketplace, if you're trying to leverage a word for word talk track in many cases instead of a framework which allows some conversation and some back and forth to happen within it, you end up just sounding really robotic, and people aren't going to connect with you and therefore your ideas if you're just coming off as really boilerplated, right? And so the I think the secret sauce is creating a methodology framework that allows for people's personalities to still shine through and allows them to set themselves up for success and know where to take the conversation next without being incredibly regimented or stringent to the point where they're just kind of not coming across with authenticity.
Having done some research on like the origins of a lot of the classic methodologies, I mean, some of them are 40 years old, right? And and I actually don't mean that as a dig, but it's more like at that time when these methodologies were built, technology wasn't where it's at. AI is not where it's at, right? So I heard someone once referred to these as just in case. So I've got 1,000 salespeople. I'm going to roll out these 2-day events all over the place, and everyone's going to get it kind of at the same time as it rolls out. That technology now is that there's this movement that I'm seeing toward just in time revenue enablement that's like where people have the ability. You don't have to go in groups of 20 for 2 days all over the world. That we have technology now that'll allow us this hyper customized solution when we need it. Are you seeing some of that?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's the technology piece of the trifecta that I previously mentioned. Really, really important functionality. We in my previous role, I had the benefit of using a couple different LMSs, and one of them had that just-in-time functionality where our reps would be going through our CRM and they would enter in a certain dynamic field, whether that was a competitor name, whether that was a certain product being attached, and up would pop information directly from our playbook, intelligently mapped to those fields, so that they would have the information on hand to influence or to positively improve their success rate, whether they were on a call at that moment, whether they were writing their records after a call, or whether they were preparing for a call. And so they didn't have to go searching for it. Another version of that functionality is Slack plugins. And so there are some LMSs that also have functionality where there's that intelligent AI assisted querying of a sales playbook where, I'm sure you've probably had this happen in the past where you've got new reps constantly coming into an organization and reps are constantly asking the exact same questions of your product teams, of your support teams. And so, without an intelligent technology solution in place, unfortunately, it just, it's very cumbersome. It bogs down the process and creates bottlenecks. It frustrates a lot of people on both sides of the situation. And so to have that intelligent querying of when somebody types in a question to a particular channel, it goes and searches through the playbook and then brings the likely answers to them immediately. That just in time capability, again, is a really, really valuable example of that type of functionality that I've seen successfully used.
Yeah, it's in one sense, those of us who have purchased methodologies in the past, the bar set pretty low. So American companies spend at last measurement about 26 billion a year on sales training. And what I've often heard, very many times heard people say is, "Hey, you know what? The good thing about sales training, if you pull a couple things out of it, it's worth it." And my reaction is, "Hell no! Are you kidding? That's 26 billion, just for the training, but let's look at the opportunity cost of all those people being out of market and everything else." And it's like that bar is just way too low because that's what's been available for 40 years.
Yeah, and I think that's where the process alignment piece really comes in, right? I mean, I when I read a book, I approach it with that mentality of, hey, 6 months from now, after finishing that book, if I've got 2 to 3 good quality takeaways, that was a worthwhile read. And that's kind of, that 80-20 rule applied to nonfiction, in my opinion, is like, really only 20% of the content out there is worth reading cover to cover. 80% of it, you can use many of the tools out there to just grab the Coles notes, because that's really, at best what you're going to remember 6 months afterwards, and certainly even less than that be utilizing. And so methodology, on the other hand, to your point, is an incredibly expensive uh, undertaking for any organization, whether you've just hired your first enablement professional and you're kind of putting everything on their shoulders to figure it out, whether you're investing in a third party company, or you have a very big and sophisticated team across maybe multiple business units. Methodology is a very big and expensive and time consuming undertaking. And so to approach it with hopefully they get a few key takeaways from it, you're just setting yourself up for failure, right? And so one of the important things in the process alignment is, how can we create gates so that our reps and managers can't simply circumnavigate our methodology, right? If they can go into the CRM and not have to enter in crucial pieces of information that we want them to capture during discovery before advancing from stage 2 to stage 3, let's say, and they can just jump through stages without having any of these gates, they're going to do that, right? We've seen it time and time again, and understandably, I think we can both relate, having been sales reps in the past. Reps are busy, time is money, and they're always going to take the path of least resistance. And so you need to set up your sales process and gates in a way that is going to reinforce the necessity of using your methodology in a do not pass go, do not collect commission type of way if you're not using it.
Yeah, it's I've done a lot of deal coaching over the years, and one of the things I've noticed is back to the speed of change thing. That when we're coaching deals, what deal pursuit teams need is more data and insight than sort of forms to fill out. And it's like at the end of the training class, you fill out the form on your deal, right? And I found that what people need now is, what, right now I'm going up against, the customer's either going to do nothing or they're going to choose this other competitor. I need data and insight right now to help me win on this deal, right? And that's what's missing in a lot of that. And I feel like that's what people need. And it's interesting too that, if you think you roll out a methodology to 500 salespeople around the world, each salesperson fills in the sheet at the end of the sales training. You've got 500 deals with all the data in the sheet. Each one has zero based that data. And I feel like the real value is if you could, accumulate all the answers that went into 500 of those sheets. That's right. And here's the best practice, right? Here's the best practice on our competitive stuff, whatever. Here are the needs of the different buyers that we impact. That's more helpful than filling in a form.
I would completely agree, and the better that you can leverage AI, in its many different forms, to enhance that process, to remove the legwork from the better, right? I think that's a really, an incredible, just ever evolving tool set that the enablers of today are going to benefit of versus the OG enablers who started 10 plus years ago and had to build a lot of this stuff from scratch.
What's the lift involved in terms of sort of like manpower and maybe time, time to build until you have something that's functioning you're rolling out? What's your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say at a level of application to any organization because, of course, every organization is different, right? Based on some of the levels of complexity that I mentioned before, how complex is your product set? How large is your organization? How many units do you have? How many different countries and time zones are you selling into, right? I mean, a lot of these things should be taken into account. And so to kind of just give, the broad strokes, if you will, it's kind of almost a little bit of a circle was the way that I've approached it in the past. Of you want to start at the top, of course, getting buy-in for the project because you don't want to go through months of creating a custom methodology or doing any sales enablement work if it's all just going to be a waste of time. So starting at the top, but then of course you want to continue down the levels. A lot of unsuccessful sales enablement products or projects, I think, fail or die on the vine because you get organizational buy-in from the top and you think, okay, I'm good. I got the green light and I'm just going to roll with it. And then everybody's naturally going to fall in line. And of course, that doesn't happen, right? You've got a lot of managers in the middle who used to be sales reps and have potentially come up selling a different way. And so, what's their belief? Do they believe they were successful doing it the old way, and so therefore they don't need to adopt and reinforce the new way with their reps? And then likewise, with the reps, right? You've got the experienced reps and the new reps learning from the experienced reps, and so all of them, the more that each of them feels like they have contributed to the overall vision that you're building towards, the better chances of success and adoption at the end. And so
It's man, that I'm sorry, that's such a great point because that's sort of one of the things that I yell from the rooftops about is this $26 billion spend. There's a lot of there's some organizations, I know a couple providers of this stuff that are very good. They won't take a contract if it's just a series of training classes. Like they're going to pull through. But most organizations, there's this kind of black hole that happens after the training events. And I love this idea that starting to think about adoption of this thing while you're designing it. Because, yeah, it's a much higher probability of use if the stakeholders contributed.
yeah, and that's it. And so to your point, two major factors in successful adoption is one, of course, figuring out the framework of how you're going to on the fly measure adoption and course correct adoption before launch. So maybe you're leveraging some of your revenue intelligence tools or others to be able to measure talk track adoption as a leading indicator, as a lagging indicator, looking at things like win rate, attach rate, so on and so forth. And then similarly, the coaching, right? There's a fantastic book, one of the first I read when getting into enablement called Transfer of Training by Broad and Newstrom. And, it talks about the keystone essentially being the manager, right? Because in sales enablement, the reality is that reps don't ever, they don't ever roll up to us. They don't report to us. And so we need to set managers up for success first by getting them engaged in the development of the program so that they put their buy-in, they put their rubber stamp on it. And then two, we need to set up a reinforcement framework because you can bet that if your managers just leave, a training or a methodology rollout and they're not prepared with at least a handful of questions to ask their reps in their weekly one-on-one meetings about how is the methodology going, where have you been seeing success, where have you been finding some hangups, how can we work through that together? If that's not happening at a one-on-one organic level on a weekly basis and the reinforcement mechanisms aren't there, again, it just simply dies on the vine and people forget about it and they go back to the status quo. right? Which is probably the most common outcome of a methodology rollout.
Like what you're doing is in line with what we learned. We went out and did a pretty big research project on trying to find companies who had deeply embedded methodology into the DNA of the organization, right? And there was few, and we studied the hell out of those, right? We surveyed reps, we surveyed the leaders, we did focus groups, and it's interesting because the so we found three things that drove adoption for these companies that did it really well. The first thing surprised me, but it's in line with what you're talking about. It was that the methodology was seen as a way to execute a company's strategy. It wasn't a training event. And it's interesting too, because I pulled in one of the focus groups, I ended up pulling this guy, Mike McCarver. This is in the report, so I can say it. He was with KLA 10 Core. And I traveled around the world with this guy, and I saw Miller Heiman blue sheets on everyone's desk all over the world. And I pulled Mike aside and I said, "How the heck did you do that?" And he said, "Look, we were growing, and we were a national company, and then we started going global, and our customers started buying globally from us, and we were still selling nationally." So someone, buying in Germany would go over to France and source because the French account manager was like giving up better pricing. And the moral of that story is, his point was, the CEO said to him, "Mike, you got to fix this. Like we need a global selling strategy, right? Because our customers are killing us." And so that tie to that strategy, and this is what we found in the research, if it's seen as an execution arm of strategy, then executive sponsorships coming in, and then frontline management sponsorships coming in. And that, as you talked about the way you built yours, I feel like it was built based on the strategy of the company.
And you're absolutely right. I think to bastardize, I believe an Einstein quote for a moment. That mentality of the way of thinking that got us here is no longer good enough moving forward, right? And that's the reality of scaling a business, right? Anyone who's read or familiar with Crossing the Chasm, right? A lot of businesses go through that pivotal growth stage, trying to scale from 2 to 10 million ARR, where the early adopters of their business think and act very differently than the mainstream does, and they try and employ the exact same tactics and strategy that was very successful in the early stages of the business when trying to scale into the maturity of their business. And of course, they learn very quickly the hard way that it doesn't work. And so to your point, if methodology is presented as, look, guys, big round of applause for everyone and their hard work in what you've done to this point and getting us here. Our rolling out of a new methodology is by no means a way of saying that what we did in the past was wrong or inadequate. It was just right for that time of our business and our marketplace. We are now scaling to a new level of maturity, a new level of market adoption, and we need to adopt a more sophisticated strategy in order to be successful in doing that. And so, whatever exactly that looks like based on the company and their industry, I think you're absolutely right. When you align the methodology and its rollout to ushering the company into the next stages of its growth, you're going to get a lot more buy-in, top down.
That very notion of sort of training events is and should be challenged at this point. Because what we really need is on demand 24/7, right? That rather than just, hey, let's roll it out, let's do the 2 days and then hope it sticks. And it's on demand enablement, but it's also tied to the strategy, and that strategy is going to be changing, right? Your value, your competitors' value, customer needs are all shifting. So I feel like that is the new definition of training, and technology, thankfully, is enabling all that.
Absolutely.
You've been super generous with your time and your ideas, and contribute to our whole community. We live in the whole selling community, so I really appreciate this, and I hope others learn from it. I think they will, because I'm beginning to see more people thinking about this.
Yeah, and always appreciated the invite, Brian. Really appreciate just kind of having these conversations, and I find that just simply chatting about these types of things reminds us of some of the things that we knew already, and also kind of inspires new creative ways of building things in the future. One thing I will say to any of your listeners out there who are on this journey of deciding what to do with their methodology, whether they're going to go with one of the big reputable third-party businesses, whether they're going to go down the journey of building it themselves, is make sure to evaluate it from a user's perspective, i.e. your reps and your managers, and make sure that the program is built in a diverse and gamified way where it's not going to be a chore to learn and adopt, but it's going to be easy, or not necessarily easy, but enjoyable, right? With multimedia rich content. So the classic, you mentioned it before, sales training model was, let's paratroop in one or two trainers for 2 or 3 days and hope that everything sticks, and then we're out and we've got no reinforcement mechanism, right? That's what sales training looked like through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And now, with the benefit of a blended learning approach, you really want to maximize the adoption, leveraging not only those classic synchronous training kind of activities and events, because it's still fun to get your whole sales team together and interact and engage, and there's lots of benefits that can come from that. But make sure that it is then further empowered by that asynchronous content, whether those are videos, practice modules, reinforcement mechanisms through coaching and call scoring. You really are looking for a well-rounded and holistic methodology in order to succeed, rather than just that classic 2 to 3 days of live training and we're out type of thing. The wham bam, thank you ma'am type of model.
I agree too. Having these conversations among lots of professionals in the enterprise selling community. In one sense, we're challenging status quo, and as you said too, that's where some of the innovation comes in. Because I appreciate today you even reminded me of some things that I forgot. It's like, wow, I need to emphasize that more. So, yeah, again, thank you very much, and I look forward to maybe we'll do this again.
Absolutely, pleasure, Brian. Great chatting with you.